Okay, so in today's video, I want to talk about this concept of consumption obstruction and what we can do as authors and writers and content creators to overcome this. Our goal as writers is not to impress your friends or to write a book and when you meet people at a party, you can tell people you're a writer and hopes you appear more sophisticated or whatever. Your goal is the same as my goal, and it's to capture consumer attention. That's it. That's the asset we're all vying for. And we're not just competing with all the books that have ever been written. We're competing for time, a precious resource, and consumers have 1,000,001 different ways that they can use that time. They can watch YouTube, they can listen to podcasts, they can exercise, hang out with friends, watch movies, listen to music, play instruments. There's 1,000,000 things that they can do. And every day there's new stuff that comes out. There's new books that are being written, new songs that are coming out, new YouTube videos, new podcasts, new movies. It's never been more difficult. The barrier to entry to promote your content has never been better than it is today. But the problem is it's kind of opened the floodgates and everybody's a content creator, and you just get this tsunami of content coming at you, and you're trying to, you have a limited time in your day to choose what you do with your time. Maybe a couple hours at night, you're working all day, you come home, you got to eat, you got to, take care of the dog, got to do dishes. There's a few things you can, maybe some relaxation time. And then you got to prepare for the next day. You got to go to bed early. You got to be up in the morning, right? So you have like maybe an hour, 2 hours where you can really hang out and, what do you do with that time? Do you watch Game of Thrones, or do you watch some YouTube videos? Do you read a book? So when you write a book and bring it to market, you're hoping that it gains some sort of, finds its audience, gains some sort of traction, and, you grow a loyal fan base, which, makes the next thing that you put out easier to consume, and maybe you could leverage that into a career of some type. But if you think about it, what you're essentially asking of the consumer is a huge ask. You're asking them, like I mentioned, there's 1,000,000 other things that they could do. You're asking them to say, hey, don't do those things. Pay attention to me and my art. And let's be fair, reading a book is not an easy thing to do. Let's say for the average person, they read less than 50 books in their entire lifetime. And there's already 1,000,000 other books, and there's more being produced each day. And let's say one book, you read it, takes, cover to cover, takes about 10 hours. That is a huge ask of somebody to say, hey, can you give me 10 hours of your time when Justin Bieber only asks you for 4 minutes of your time? If you're listening to a podcast, it's like an hour, a movie, 2 hours, but a book, 10 hours, maybe 20 hours, that's a huge time investment to ask of somebody. So we have to be respectful of their time. And when someone makes a decision to forego all other options and pay attention to your book or your art, you have to deliver. Your audience wants to escape. They want to be entertained. They want to engage in this other world that you've created. You want to take the words from the page and paint a picture in their head that's so vivid that they become enthralled and they fall into this world and become so consumed with the content. It's like the so-called page turner. So the reason I go on this big rant is for the simple reason that our jobs as writers is to first write a book and bring it to market and have it compete with all other forms of entertainment that's vying for that same piece of attention that consumer has. So in order for us to kind of stand a chance and compete in this marketplace, we have to produce a book that will be engaging. So in a very intriguing premise, something that captures the consumer's attention, something they've never seen before, an engaging title, captivating cover art. So while all this is incredibly difficult and becoming more and more difficult each day because there's new content that's coming out, our job is not done. We still need to capture the reader's attention throughout the entire book and have the the ending, the conclusion pay off in such a way that's, life-changing and perception-altering, and, they want to become an advocate of you. They share it on social media, and they give you 5-star reviews, and they tell their friends, and they can't wait to buy the next thing that you put out. So we want to remove the consumption obstructions. And so what I mean by this is to remove any barriers for somebody to say no to reading your book. And kind of topping that list, I would say, is book length. Now, this is very subjective, and I'm not an expert on this, but this is just my own opinion. So it is my opinion that readers' attention span is getting shorter and shorter. And so when you present them with an 800-page epic, I'm willing to bet that that's going to turn a lot of people off, and they won't want to read it. I've been trying to get my stories to around 60,000 words, which is traditionally on the shorter end of a novel. But my assumption is that people want something that's a quick read. And if there's any more story to be told after 60,000 words, I just write a sequel. So I don't feel like I have that same problem. The next thing I would say is chapter length. Now, again, this is all subjective. You might have your own opinions, but studying kind of human behavior and psychology, I feel that people have a very short window of time to consume content, maybe 30 minutes to an hour. Maybe they're waiting for a bus, or they're waiting for their appointment, or they're, in the final 10 minutes before bed. They want to, quickly read through a chapter. If your chapters are 40 pages long and they're very dense with like lots of description, lots of characters interacting, convoluted plot, that's a obstruction to consumption. That's not making them consume that any easier. So what I would recommend is considering a shorter book, shorter chapters, shorter sentences, and use language that's appropriate for your audience. So it's kind of a fine balance, because you don't want to, have a too simple language, which is too easy to read and it'll turn people off. You don't want it too complicated, which will turn people off. You got to kind of find that balance, which is not always easy. So I'll admit it, I'm guilty of this too. In my book Prodigy, I broke a cardinal rule, which is opening a book with a long introduction, and then the next chapter is a prologue, and then the next piece is chapter 1. So it actually takes you there's 3 different sections before you get to chapter 1. And I'll say that the intro to Prodigy, if you read it, is actually kind of academic. Like the language I'm using is like, I'm saying things like Pyrrhic victory, which I don't know a lot of people are going to know what that is, but there's a lot of kind of academic language. And this is probably because I was an academic when I wrote the book, and I was used to writing philosophy essays. So that's just the kind of language I was using. But starting a book with an intro and then a prologue and then chapter 1, I just felt it was necessary. And ironically, it's my most popular book by far. There's maybe a few reasons for that. I think the cover is interesting. It's mysterious in some ways. Got a picture of a female, so like a silhouette of female, so maybe that invites a female audience. Prodigy sounds interesting. What's that about? When you get past the intro and the prologue, the chapters are very short. The book is very short. It's about 60,000 words. The book, when you read it, it's not complicated. There's really only 3 to 5 main characters. I get you as deep into the story as possible. And I think the concept is interesting. It's futuristic. It's about, what would a world be like if everyone could just download information in their head and everyone was smart, and, racism was a thing of the past and discrimination was a thing in the past. So I think it has a lot going for it, despite kind of breaking these rules. So in talking about Prodigy, I kind of mentioned a few things that it avoided the consumption obstructions. So I'll just go over that again really quickly and maybe explain a little bit what I mean by each and how you can avoid it yourself. So the first one is language. I mentioned this. If you have really complicated language and your writing is not clear, it's difficult. I think reading fiction is actually a very difficult thing to do. It's different than reading nonfiction, because with fiction requires more work from the reader. They have to, juggle different characters, and they have to anticipate how the plot is going to unfold, and they have to remember certain things about the plot. And that's a lot of mental energy to kind of take you through the story. It's not this passive consumption like watching a movie or, reading some some textbook. Well, textbook's a bad example because there's like facts and things you need to memorize, but like a Malcolm Gladwell book, like one of those nonfiction books about psychology or whatever. There's nothing really for you to anticipate, no characters to juggle, no relationships. So knowing that, the more complicated you have your plot, and the more characters you have interacting, if the names of your characters are not easy to pronounce or easy to remember, it's an obstruction. Having a convoluted plot that's not well written, it's not clear. So somebody's reading, they're 10 chapters in, they have no idea what's happening. I mean, we've all read books like that. You're halfway through and you're like, I have no idea what's happening. I couldn't tell you one thing that I read in the last 10 pages. Your mind starts to wander. You close the book and you say, this book sucks. This person in this hypothetical scenario didn't respect the reader's attention and didn't practice clarity. So the next thing is chapter length. Again, completely subjective. I try to aim for around 800 to 1500. My sweet spot is around 1200. I try to have 1200 word chapters, which I think move the story. They're very short and punchy and very quick to get through. My sentences, I don't have really long run-on sentences. The languages I use, I try to pick words that are appropriate for the audience. In terms of book length, I try to have something around 60,000 words, which is a little bit more digestible than some 800-page epic. And anything beyond that I've missed out, I'll just save that for the sequel. So the next thing is descriptions. So again, personal preference, I tend not to be so heavy-handed with descriptions. When you're describing a scene, describe everything in the room, you describe the character and the weather, and describe how the carpet felt under the person's feet, and describe the painting and the smells. I don't tend to do that. I mean, maybe you do, maybe you like that. I don't even tell you what the character looks like, other than their gender and their age and their name. Being overly descriptive, spending 3 pages to talk about how somebody poured a cup of tea is too much. And that's a barrier, a consumption obstruction. I'm not saying you can't do this. All I'm saying is just be mindful that there's going to be a percentage of people that are going to get turned off by that. So my personal preference, I tend not to have, go heavy on the descriptions. And I feel like the reader, by going light on the descriptions, I invite the reader to draw their own conclusions of, what race they are, what they look like, what kind of clothes they're wearing, and, makes them more engaged. Okay, so the next thing I'll say is getting into the story as quickly as possible. And one question I ask myself is, if I removed chapter 1 or chapter 2 or whatever and started the story a little bit later, what if I started the story in chapter 3? Would I lose anything important? And there's books that, my book, Eden, it's this book where this couple goes traveling to Europe, right? So the original 3 chapters of that book were, running around, packing, saying goodbye to family, getting last minute items, all before traveling to the airport. It was all this lead up. And chapter 2 or 3 was them actually at the airport on the plane. So I just started the book of this couple on the plane, and all that packing, just assume that the characters would have packed or said goodbyes or whatever. So I don't actually need that. That was a good example of where I started the story as deep into the story as possible. Any relevant information can always be brought up later if need be. And another technique that I use, because I'm inviting readers on a journey, through my book, and I want them to think and feel a certain way when they read it. And it doesn't necessarily make sense to move on to another part if people are not all on board with what previously happened. What I mean is that sometimes, from time to time, I will do a recap where a character will explain to another character what the last 10 chapters was about. And maybe it'll take, a sentence or 2 or a paragraph or whatever. So they'll say, that's crazy that we did this and met up with this person and they gave us this information and said this, right? Just so the reader can be like, it's like anchors them. They go, oh, okay, yeah, that is what I just read. Okay, so I haven't missed anything. And then I move you on to the next piece, and then I'll do another recap. It's like, oh, that's crazy how this happened, this happened, this happened. And now we're about to do this thing. And then, so I'm kind of, I'm not really holding the reader's hand, but I'm just kind of making sure we're all on the same page. And so, I mean, I may do this, I may not, and I may do it several times throughout the book, depending how complicated the plot is. So in the interest of that, I will do that for this video. So these are the things I talked about. Things that you can do to avoid consumption obstruction are, be mindful of chapter length, be mindful of book length, be mindful of the language that you use. Don't be so heavy-handed on descriptions, be mindful of it. Try to, if you have an overly complicated plot, see if there's a way to simplify it. Do recaps if necessary. Get into the story as quickly as possible. If you can, try not to have so many characters. So that's it. Those are some of the ways that you can avoid consumption obstruction. If you missed any of the stuff I talked about and you want to check out the show notes, there's a link in the description, the links to my blog, which I talk about all the stuff that I talked about in this video. So thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you're not already subscribed, and I'll see you next time.